Today, Chris read a passage from John that feels mysterious, and at the same time, it sounds kind of commonplace. It's sort of like the stuff of legend. It's mysterious because it happened after Jesus had already appeared to his disciples following his death a couple of times in a resurrected form. He'd come to the place where they were hiding out together in Jerusalem, and he'd shown Thomas, doubting Thomas as he's called, his wounds from being crucified. Now, since none of us were there, no one knows exactly what it even means to say that Jesus was in a resurrected form. What did that look like? On the one hand, it seems he could appear and disappear suddenly, sort of like a ghost. On the other hand, he could show someone his wounds and be touched. So he had a real physical presence of some kind, according to the Gospels. And as our story goes today, he could make a campfire and grill fish and eat it. And that's what makes the story feel so commonplace. That scene of fishermen gathering for breakfast on the shore of a big lake, sitting around a fire together, that kind of thing happened every single day. The only unusual thing about it was the one who had prepared the meal, Jesus. He had been their friend, their teacher, and they'd seen him do some remarkable things. Now, they did not understand everything he'd ever said and done while they traveled around the countryside with him for roughly 3 years. And now, in this scene, it's safe to say it went way beyond their experience to be sitting around having breakfast with him after he had died. That would be like attending someone's funeral at the cemetery and then meeting them for brunch a few days later. That would be a little unusual. You might begin questioning your own sanity. But look, there he is. So there was no playbook for this, no precedent. Even after they'd seen him back in Jerusalem after his death, they still really had no idea what that meant or what they were to do next. They just knew it was very, very strange, and they probably needed time to process things. I know I would. So they went back to the only life they knew before they ever had met Jesus. They went back home and right back to fishing. If nothing else, they just needed to sort things out. But then Jesus shows up again at the lakeshore, and John later tells us this would in fact turn out to be the last time that any of them saw Jesus up close and personal. So Jesus asks their leader, Simon Peter, a question. It was very simple. He says, "Do you love me?" And 3 times he asks this same question. And every time Peter says, "Yes, of course, you know I love you. I do." And Jesus says, "Well then, feed my lambs, tend and feed my sheep." That's it. That's all Jesus says. And from this experience, the disciples thought they knew what that meant. Whenever Jesus had talked previously about a good shepherd, it seemed pretty clear he was referring to himself. And whenever he had talked about sheep, it seemed pretty clear Jesus was referring to everyone else. Now, some people hear this story and they interpret it to mean that, well, here was Jesus passing the torch of leadership over to Peter because Jesus was not going to stay around much longer, and at least in a way they could see him and see and hear him quite so clearly. So somebody had to carry on as head of this group, and that somebody was Peter. And maybe that is all this story is about. At least that's how I learned it in Sunday school. But now I don't think that's all there is to it. We should pay attention to one thing, what Jesus was actually saying. If Jesus was merely passing the torch, wouldn't it be more specific? Wouldn't there be some plan of action he would give them? This would be a great moment to roll out a chalkboard like a football coach does at halftime and say, well, first, Peter, you're going to get the ball, move left, John's going to go deep, but you hand it off to Thomas, and so on. But no, nothing like that. And there were no instructions either given about reach out to and convert these people, but not those people. Or even for that matter, there was no command at all to go forth and start up a whole new religion. There was no creed or confession of faith to memorize or to recite, no checklist of acceptable or unacceptable beliefs or practices to follow. There were no hoops to jump through before you were welcomed in. Nothing at all about which hymns you were supposed to sing in church, or how to organize a bake sale, or balance the budget. It was simply, if you love me, tend and feed my sheep. That's it. Any way you look at it, that is a pretty broad call to action. The problem was the disciples were only human, and humans have this tendency, just seems to be a deep seated need we have, to categorize people. Now, you could just say you're getting yourself organized, but so often getting organized means deciding who's in and who's out. So, the broadest way to categorize is to say there are people like us and people who are obviously not like us. That can be based on physical appearances or geography or language or economics or politics or gender or maybe age. For some reason that no one's really ever been able to figure out, we humans just feel more comfortable and safe if we can look at another person across the room or see someone on TV who lives on another continent and say to ourselves, oh yeah, I know what they're like. Or at the very least, I know they're not like me or they're not like us. They're not part of my tribe. And that tendency to categorize people is absolutely one of the most powerful things going on whenever it comes to religion. In fact, it may be the most powerful thing about organized religion. It always has been that way. To define your religion by pointing out how it is different from somebody else's religion. To define people by their beliefs. I get that all the time. People ask me, well, what does your church believe? Because they want to know how we differ from other churches. And if I said, it doesn't matter what our church believes, that would strike most people as really absurd. You got to believe in something, right? And it most definitely was that way for Peter and the disciples. It was only natural for them to take the message of Jesus, all that he had taught and all that he did, and the wonderful mystery and the power of love that was greater than even death itself. It was natural for them to take that and say, now this is all true, but it's only true for a certain type of people, for people who look like us, talk like us, who come from the same part of the world as us, and most importantly, who have the same religious beliefs as us. And at least to start, that's exactly what they did after they left their fishing careers behind. They returned to Jerusalem and they tried to spread their understanding of Jesus with varying degrees of success, but also not without getting into a lot of trouble. Thing is, they restricted their message only to people who fit into one certain category, Jewish people. It was beyond their imagining, apparently, that when Jesus told Peter to tend and feed my sheep, that Jesus could be referring to sheep who were not Jewish. Now, Peter eventually did come around to understanding that a sheep could mean anyone and everyone, whether or not you were Jewish, but that was much later. We read about that in the book of Acts. And the funny thing is, or maybe the really sad thing, is that even after the earliest Christians began accepting non-Jews into their movement, so much so that the non-Jews quickly outnumbered the folks with a Jewish background, that old human need to categorize reared its head again. Now, we're often taught, or we just assume, that Christianity in the early days was one big happy family that grew and grew in a natural arc through the power of the Holy Spirit and became a dominant religion because it was the one true religion. But let's get real. If you've never heard it before, hear it from me. It was not one big happy family. Far from it. It's much more accurate to say that Christianity didn't grow and expand, but that a whole slew of various types of Christianities, plural, competed with each other. They wanted to claim the title of the one true faith. So in the first few hundred years after that breakfast cookout on the lakeshore, people who claimed to love Jesus, just like Peter did, fought with each other tooth and nail about who Jesus was and what he really meant. They disagreed on so many things that you and I might think are silly and inconsequential, but they believed were essential. Why? because people might love Jesus, but they also love to categorize, to insist it's only if you believe X, Y, and Z. It's only if you say this creed or this confession of faith out loud. And it's only if you sing this hymn and not that one. And it's only if you look just like us, think just like us, dress just like us, and dance the hokey pokey just like us that you can ever be one of us. And as time went on, those categories of who could be a sheep and who could not fractured and grew more numerous until today there are an estimated 45,000 distinct Christian groups or denominations, and that's probably a low number. It's silly. Somewhere between Jesus giving Peter a very straightforward command, if you love me, tend and feed my sheep, and today, I wonder how well we're really doing that. We're still a lot more interested, apparently, in creating categories. And the one thing categories do best is to exclude people. So that means categories go against everything Jesus represents. When his every word, when his every action, when he proved that love is more powerful than anything, all of that points to one thing only, that God is not interested in categorizing anyone, but created us for the purpose of welcoming and loving everyone. That to love Jesus means you simply take care of each other, that you tend and feed my sheep, that you don't worry about who is us and who is them, as if we're in some kind of a contest over who gets to be right. And me being right means that you're wrong. So I win, apparently. And I just can't imagine Jesus ever endorsing that kind of thinking. To love Jesus doesn't mean that we're one thing over here and another thing over there. It means that we are one thing. We're all of us, all of humanity, all of God's creation. We are all sheep. It's simply not our prerogative to ever claim that God only loves and accepts you if you say the right set of words or you hold a precise set of beliefs. How presumptuous and absurd that is for any of us to place categories on what God refuses to categorize. But how wonderful and liberating it is for us to serve our neighbor, to care for our neighbor, to feed our neighbor, to tend to our neighbor, to love our neighbor, who are also known as sheep. And to realize that to do that is exactly what it means to love Jesus. Amen.